I've never trusted empty playgrounds at night. There's something about the way the equipment stands there, silent, skeletal shapes against a dark sky, that makes my skin tighten. They always look as if they're waiting, holding a breath you can't hear. But that evening, I wasn't thinking about that. I was only looking for a shortcut, a path through the small park that would shave a few minutes off my walk home. The air had a late autumn bite, sharp enough to sting the tips of my ears and settle a damp chill into the seams of my jacket. I remember the faint smell of wet leaves mixed with the iron scent of cold metal. The clouds above were a heavy blanket of dark gray, the kind that swallows moonlight and keeps the world dim. Even the streetlights along the road seemed to bleed their glow into the mist, casting a sickly orange halo that barely reached the path. The park sat lower than the surrounding streets, a shallow bowl of cracked asphalt paths and thinning grass. As I descended the slope, the noises of the neighborhood, cars, distant televisions, a barking dog, faded until only the soft crunch of my own footsteps on damp gravel remained. That silence felt heavy, like a weight pressing against my ears. I adjusted my scarf and kept walking, trying to ignore the sudden awareness of how alone I was. At the center of the park stood a small playground. Rusted monkey bars, a slide with peeling blue paint, a roundabout with one bent handle. And at the far corner, almost hidden by a leaning chain-link fence, was a single swing set. The frame was an old-fashioned A-shape, chipped white paint revealing gray steel beneath. Two swings hung there, their rubber seats slick with moisture, chains faintly rattling with each shift of the air. That's when I heard it. A slow creak, faint but distinct, the sound of metal hinges complaining under strain. I stopped. There was no wind, not anymore. The trees were still, their branches etched black against the dark sky. My breath puffed out in pale clouds as I stood perfectly still, listening. The creak came again, steady, rhythmic. I turned my head toward the swing set. One of the swings was moving. Not a gentle sway left over from a breeze, but a deliberate back-and-forth arc, slow and steady. The seat glided through the air with a soft hiss, the chains stretching taut at the height of each pass before falling again, the hinges groaning with every motion. The second swing hung motionless, perfectly still beside it. I tried to tell myself it was the wind after all, a gust I hadn't felt, maybe a current of air funneled through the trees. But the leaves above didn't stir. The grass at my feet didn't tremble. The air was heavy and still, like the inside of a sealed room. I stood there for what felt like a long time, eyes locked on that swinging seat, waiting for it to slow. It didn't. The smell of wet metal grew stronger, sharp and faintly sour, as though the iron frame was sweating. My throat felt dry despite the dampness of the night. I took a cautious step closer, gravel crunching softly beneath my shoe. The sound seemed too loud, echoing across the empty park. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to keep moving, to get out of there, but something about the motion of the swing pinned me in place. I moved closer until I stood at the edge of the wood-chip border that framed the playground. The ground here was soft and uneven, a patchwork of damp mulch and shallow puddles. I could hear the chains more clearly now, a faint rattle with each rise and fall, like coins shifting inside a metal box. The seat cut through the cold air with a faint whistle, slicing back and forth with an unnatural steadiness. It wasn't slowing down. If anything, the arc seemed to sharpen, the swing rising a little higher each time, as though an unseen force was giving it a gentle push. My eyes kept darting to the empty seat, half expecting to see something perched there, a weight that explained the movement. But the rubber strip was empty, slick with condensation that caught the weak glow of a nearby streetlight. Droplets clung to the chain links like tiny beads of glass. With each pass, I could feel a faint movement of air against my face, not a breeze, but the displaced breath of the swing's motion. I don't know how long I stood there watching. Time felt distorted, stretched thin by the rhythmic sway. My heartbeat matched the slow cadence of the creaking hinges. The smell of rust and wetwood filled my nose, mingling with the earthy rot of fallen leaves. I became aware of small details, the way the shadow of the moving swing stretched and retracted across the damp mulch, the faint squeak of the chain where it rubbed against itself, the the sharp chill settling into my fingertips despite my pockets. A faint sensation crept up my back, an awareness like the air behind me had thickened. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it, the subtle pressure of a presence standing just beyond the edge of my perception. My skin prickled. I forced myself not to turn around, not to break the fragile barrier between me and whatever was there. Instead, I kept my eyes on the swing, focusing on the hypnotic motion as though it could shield me. The chains began to rattle more violently, though the swing itself did not speed up. It remained steady, precise, while the metal links shivered as if something invisible gripped them tightly. A thin, high whine rose from the hinges, almost like a breath squeezed through clenched teeth. I took an involuntary step backward, my heels sinking into the wet mulch with a soft squelch. The sound of it echoed unnaturally loud in the dead air. The swing rose higher now, nearly parallel with the ground at the peak of its arc, then descended with a deliberate grace that defied gravity. There was no sign of effort, no acceleration or slowing, just a perfect, endless rhythm. My chest tightened. Every rational thought screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. I felt rooted to the spot, like the damp earth had clenched around my shoes. Then, without warning, the swing stopped. Not a gradual slowdown, not a final sway. It halted mid-arc, frozen in the air as if time itself had paused. The chains went silent. The rubber seat hovered perfectly still, suspended in a way that should have been impossible. I exhaled sharply, realizing I had been holding my breath. That's when I heard it. A sound behind me, soft and close. Not a footstep, not a voice. Just the faintest exhalation, a slow, deliberate breath drawn through a narrow throat. Warm, wet, and unmistakably human. The air around me tightened. The smell of rust grew metallic and sharp, filling my nose with the taste of blood. Every hair on my arms lifted. I forced myself to turn, though every nerve screamed not to. There was nothing. Only the shadowed park, the silent trees, the dim smear of distant streetlights. Empty. Completely empty. When I turned back to the swing, it was moving again. Slowly. Back and forth. Back and forth. The same steady rhythm as before. Something broke inside me then, some thin barrier between paralysis and panic. I backed away, my steps quick and clumsy across the slick mulch, eyes locked on that relentless motion. The chains creaked with each pass, the sound echoing like laughter in the cold air. I didn't stop moving until I reached the street, until the orange glow of the streetlights washed over me and the distant sounds of traffic returned. Only then did I glance back. The swing was still visible through the skeletal trees, a dark shape against the dim playground. It was still moving. Long after I had left the park, long after the wind had stopped, it kept moving.
I don't know why I decided to walk through the old neighborhood park that night. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavier than usual, a kind of pressure that sat on the skin like damp wool. Maybe it was the moon, swollen and pale, spilling a milky glow over the cracked sidewalks and rusted playground equipment. Whatever it was, I found myself drawn to the place long after the town had gone to sleep. The park was a remnant from my childhood. The city had stopped maintaining it years ago, leaving it to decay beneath layers of peeling paint and rotting wood. The swing sets leaned slightly to one side, their chains brown with rust. The slides were coated with a dull film of dust that stuck to my shoes when I stepped near them. The sandbox sat at the center like a sunken square of darkness, the wooden frame warped from years of rain. I remembered it being much larger when I was a child, but that night it looked small and strangely deep, as if the sand had been sinking into the earth for years. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold iron. I could taste the metallic bite of the playground equipment even before I touched anything. A faint hum of distant traffic reached me, muffled by the thick canopy of trees that ringed the park. Their branches swayed only slightly in a breeze so light it barely moved the hair on my arms. I stopped near the sandbox, my breath leaving faint clouds in the moonlight. The sand looked unnaturally smooth, as if someone had raked it earlier despite the park being abandoned. No footprints broke the surface. It was a clean, pale sheet of grit that seemed to glow faintly under the moon. I stood there longer than I should have. The night felt heavy, the way air feels before a storm. A cold prickled at the back of my neck. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from a sudden drop in temperature. It was the kind that seems to seep from the ground itself, rising like a warning. That's when I heard the first sound. It was soft, so soft I might have mistaken it for the creak of a distant branch. But it came again, a single deliberate step. The faint crunch of sand pressed under weight. I froze. The sound hadn't come from the playground's edges. It came from the sandbox itself. My eyes darted across the smooth surface. No footprints. Nothing moved. Then another step, clearer this time. Not the shuffle of a raccoon or the scrape of a branch. A footstep. Human. Measured. Slow. The sound circled. I could hear the faint drag of grit against wood, as if something were pacing along the inner edge of the sandbox frame. One step at a time, evenly spaced. The rhythm of someone walking in a perfect circle. I backed away, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. The footsteps did not stop. They followed the same steady pattern, circling, circling, circling. But the sand remained untouched, still smooth, still perfect under the moonlight. I strained my ears. The steps had a texture to them, a weight that made the wood groan softly beneath each pass. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. I could almost feel the vibration through the soles of my shoes. A faint smell began to rise, subtle at first, like damp soil after a rain. Then stronger, sharper, a scent of earth mixed with something metallic, like iron or blood. The air tasted stale, as if it hadn't moved in years. I turned slowly, scanning the perimeter of the playground. The trees stood like black silhouettes against the glowing sky, their branches tangled like veins. No movement, no shadow except my own. But the steps continued, around and around, always the same speed, always the same distance. The sound seemed to seep into the ground, echoing from below rather than above. I thought about leaving. My legs screamed for it, but some stubborn corner of my mind wanted to see what would happen next. The same curiosity that draws you to stare into dark water, even when you know something might be looking back. The steps slowed, not stopping, just slower, like a predator adjusting its pace. Then, without warning, they quickened. The sound darted around the sandbox faster and faster until it became a blur of crunching grit and groaning wood. I could no longer pick out individual steps. It was a continuous, frantic loop, a circle of motion I could not see. The smell of iron grew stronger. I tasted it on my tongue, bitter and sharp. The air around the sandbox shimmered faintly, as though heat were rising from the cold sand. I squinted, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw depressions forming, a faint ring of darker sand tracing the path of the invisible footsteps. Then silence. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the noise itself. The night held its breath. Even the distant hum of traffic vanished. Only the moonlight remained, cold and indifferent. I took a step back. The gravel beneath me cracked like breaking bone. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat loud enough to fill the empty park. That's when the sand moved. Not a shift from wind or weight, but a deliberate disturbance. A small puff of dust rose near the center, then another. It was as if something were walking inward now, step by step, toward the heart of the sandbox. The depressions were faint, but unmistakable. Each step left a shallow print that sank deeper than the last. They formed a straight line toward the middle, where the sand began to darken as if damp. I couldn't breathe. The smell of iron was overwhelming now, sharp enough to sting my nose. The moonlight caught the prints, giving them a wet sheen that shimmered like fresh blood. A sound broke the stillness, a slow exhale, deep and hollow, as though the earth itself were breathing out. It rattled through the sandbox and into the wood frame, a vibration that crawled up my legs and settled in my chest. I stumbled back, my heel catching on a root. I fell hard onto the gravel, the sharp stones biting into my palms. The cold from the ground felt alive, crawling up my arms in thin, icy tendrils. The sand kept moving. The prints reached the exact center, then stopped. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the sand began to sink. Slow at first, like water draining from a basin. The center collapsed inward, forming a shallow funnel. The sound of shifting grit was soft but relentless, a dry hiss that filled the air. I scrambled to my feet. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. I watched, helpless, as the funnel deepened until it became a hole. A perfectly round cavity, darker than the night around it. From that hole came a faint scraping, like nails dragging across stone. It rose and fell in a rhythm, almost like breathing. Then another step. Not from the hole. Behind me, I spun around, heart thundering. The gravel path stretched empty in both directions. No movement, no shadow, but I heard it again. Closer. A single, deliberate step on the wood frame of the sandbox. The air around me thickened, heavy as wet cloth. My vision tunneled, the moonlight dimming to a sickly gray. The smell of iron burned in my throat. I ran. I don't remember leaving the park. I don't remember the streets I crossed or the doors I unlocked. All I remember is the sound of footsteps behind me, never rushing, never slowing, always keeping the same steady pace. Even now, I hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the world goes still and the moon hangs heavy above the trees. A soft crunch of invisible steps, circling, circling, circling. And sometimes, when the wind dies completely, I can still smell the iron. A reminder that the sandbox is still there, waiting. It was a mistake to cut through the old park that night. I had walked past the rusting gates 100 times before, always keeping my eyes forward, never lingering on the shapes beyond the sagging chain-link fence. But the shortcut was tempting. The main road was slick with late autumn drizzle, the air sharp with the scent of wet leaves and cold asphalt. My boots were already soaked, and the thought of shaving 15 minutes off my walk home was enough to drown out the low hum of warning in the back of my mind. The gate yawned open with the smallest push, a mouth of warped metal and peeling paint. Its hinges groaned like something long asleep and reluctant to wake. Inside, the air felt different, thicker somehow, damp and stale, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The faint streetlights behind me bled only a weak, amber haze across the cracked pavement. Beyond the gate, the darkness folded in like a damp blanket. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not rot exactly, but a sourness buried beneath the scent of wet soil. Rusted iron, mold clinging to old wood. It mingled with the sweet, almost medicinal tang of decaying leaves. Each breath tasted like water left too long in a metal cup. I kept walking. The path, once paved with bright, painted stones, was now a jagged mosaic of broken concrete and patches of moss. My flashlight beam jittered across warped benches, their slats twisted and blackened by years of rain. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped in a steady rhythm, slow, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock that no longer kept time. The playground emerged from the fog like a memory half remembered. The swings hung motionless, chains slick with condensation. The merry-go-round was a dark circle sunk half into the soil, its once bright colors stripped to dull shades of iron and brown. Grass pushed up through every seam in the cracked asphalt, reclaiming what had been stolen. But my eyes were drawn immediately to the slide. It stood at the far end of the lot, a skeletal tower of faded red plastic and metal supports streaked with black rust. The ladder leaned slightly to one side, the bolts at its base slick with corrosion. The slide itself curved downward in a long, smooth arc, its surface slick with dew. A thin mist clung to it, a faint silver sheen under the distant glow of a single half-dead floodlight. Something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the way it seemed untouched compared to everything else, as if time had eroded the rest of the playground but hesitated here. The paint was dulled, yes, but intact. No graffiti, no deep scratches. Only a faint sheen of moisture and the subtle reflection of my own pale face in the beam of my flashlight. I stepped closer, my boots squelched in the wet grass. The air grew colder with each step, heavy and damp like the inside of a cave. The smell of metal intensified, sharp and almost coppery. I ran my fingers along the railing of the ladder. It was slick but warm, as though someone else had just been there. Then I heard it. Soft. High. A sound that cut through the muffled silence like a thread of glass. Laughter. A child's laughter. Thin and distant, but unmistakable. It floated from somewhere near the top of the slide, a sound light enough to be carried on the smallest breath of wind. A giggle quick and bright, followed by a sharp inhale, like a child catching their breath after running. I froze. The air around me tightened, thick enough to press against my skin. My flashlight flickered once, a nervous pulse of white in the fog. I told myself it was a trick, water dripping from the metal, a stray animal rustling in the weeds. But the sound came again, clear this time. A single, sharp peal of laughter that echoed off the metal like the ringing of a bell. No breeze stirred the trees. The swings remained still. Only the laughter moved. I tilted my head back and aimed the flashlight up the ladder. Empty. The rungs gleamed wetly, each slick bar catching the light. The platform at the top was bare. No footprints. No sign of movement. just cold metal and mist. And yet, the laughter came again, but now it seemed to swirl around me, bouncing off the slide's curved interior, wrapping itself around my ears. It carried an edge I hadn't noticed before, a breathy rasp beneath the childish trill, like someone trying to stifle a cough. The ground beneath me felt softer, spongier, as though the soil had turned to wet sponge. My boots sank slightly with each shift of weight. I tasted iron on the back of my tongue. I backed away, my light trembling across the fog. The laughter followed, not louder, but closer. It skipped through the air in irregular bursts, short giggles, drawn-out sighs, the faint creak of something shifting on metal. My heart pounded hard enough to throb in my fingertips. Something moved at the top of the slide. Just a flicker, a dark shape breaking the beam of my flashlight before vanishing into the mist. I snapped the light upward, breath caught in my throat. The platform was empty. Only the thin fog curled lazily around the railing. Then, without warning, the sound changed. A single, sharp clack echoed from the ladder, as if a small foot had stepped onto the first rung. Another followed. Slow, deliberate, metal groaning with weight. I couldn't see anything, but I heard it. Step by step, the unseen climber ascended. Each creak of metal vibrated through the damp air and into my chest. My body locked in place, a puppet with cut strings. The smell of rust thickened until it tasted like blood. When the final step rang out, silence fell. A pause so deep it seemed to swallow the night. Then came the slide, a soft hiss of something smooth gliding down plastic. The faint squeal of moisture against metal. Downward, closer, faster. The sound grew until it reached the curve near the bottom, and nothing. No figure emerged. No child burst laughing onto the wet grass. The base of the slide gaped empty, a dark mouth dripping condensation. My flashlight flickered again. The mist thickened, coiling low around the playground like smoke. Somewhere inside it, the laughter started again. Not distant now, not playful. A wet, bubbling giggle pressed directly against my ear. I spun, the beam slicing through empty air. My breath came in shallow bursts. Every sound, the drip of water, the faint hum of the broken floodlight, seemed sharpened to a knife's edge. The laughter circled me, darting from one side to the other, never settling in one place. High and low at once. Fast and slow. Childlike, but threaded with something far older. Something brushed my sleeve. Cold. Damp. The pressure of small fingers curling briefly against the fabric before vanishing. I stumbled back toward the gate. My boots slipped on the wet concrete, splashing through shallow puddles that hadn't been there before. The laughter followed, skipping between the shadows, echoing inside the hollow structures of the playground. It rose in pitch until it was almost a scream, then cut off abruptly, like a breath held too long. The gate loomed ahead, warped metal gleaming under the streetlight beyond. I shoved it open with both hands. The hinges shrieked like something alive. The cold night air outside hit me like a slap, dry, sharp, clean. Behind me, the playground lay silent. I turned once, just once, before stepping out. The slide stood in the fog, slick and gleaming as though freshly washed. At the top, where the mist was thickest, a small shadow leaned over the railing. Its outline was wrong, too long in the arms, too narrow in the head. But what struck me most was the sound. A single giggle. Soft, delicate, almost tender. Then silence. I didn't look back again. I walked until the night swallowed the park completely, until the smell of rust and wet metal faded from my clothes, until the phantom taste of iron left the back of my throat. Even now, I sometimes wake to the faint echo of that laugh. It lingers in the dark corners of my room, light and brittle as glass, reminding me that some shortcuts are never worth the time they save. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp wood, old paint curling like brittle paper, and the faint, metallic tang of rust carried through the night air. It mixed with the scent of wet soil and dying leaves, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and lingers in the back of your throat long after you leave. I had been wandering for hours, drawn deeper into the forgotten corners of a park I had only meant to pass through. It was close to midnight when I found the Carousel. The trees parted suddenly, revealing a small clearing bathed in the dim glow of a half-hidden moon. The Carousel sat in the center like an abandoned relic, a circle of chipped horses frozen mid-gallop. Their colors were long gone, just faded streaks of dull blue and pale gold beneath layers of peeling paint. The canopy above them sagged slightly, streaked with black mildew, its fabric flapping faintly in the cold wind. I don't know why I felt pulled toward it. Maybe it was the sound, or maybe the stillness itself. Everything around me was quiet, but not the comforting kind of quiet. It was the heavy, muffled silence that makes you hear your own breathing too loudly, the sort of silence that seems to be waiting for something. The air was cold enough to bite. My shoes crunched over gravel as I stepped closer. Each footfall seemed to echo, carrying across the empty clearing like small, hesitant announcements. That's when I noticed it, something seated near the center of the carousel. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a darker blot against the dimness, shaped roughly like a person sitting slouched on one of the inner benches. My eyes strained against the moonlight. The figure was motionless, more like a smear of darkness than a body. But there was a density to it, a weight, as if the night itself had folded inward to occupy a single spot. I froze. The air pressed in around me. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of wood, seemed amplified. I could feel my pulse beating in my ears. The figure didn't move. It didn't even breathe. Yet I could sense it was aware of me, the way a predator is aware of the trembling rabbit on the edge of a clearing. I forced myself to take another step. The gravel under my shoes sounded too loud, each crunch a small betrayal of my own presence. The shadow didn't react. It simply remained there, sitting with its back slightly hunched, as if it were waiting for something or someone to join it. The closer I got, the more the air changed. The cold deepened until it felt like the air itself was draining the warmth from my skin. I could smell the sharp sting of rust from the carousel poles, mixed with something faintly sweet, like old cotton candy left to rot in the rain. The scent made my stomach tighten. I stepped onto the carousel platform. The wood groaned beneath my weight, a hollow, drawn-out sound that echoed through the clearing. The figure remained where it was, a smear of black against the pale wooden bench. I tried to focus, to make out a face, a shape, anything that would turn it into something explainable. But the shadow resisted definition. It didn't have edges. It was like looking at smoke that refused to move. My eyes kept sliding over it, unable to lock onto anything solid. Yet the more I looked, the more I felt it looking back. The air smelled stronger now, rust, wet wood, and something faintly sour, like breath against the back of my neck. I realized I had stopped breathing. My chest ached as I forced a slow inhale, and with it came the taste of damp metal on my tongue. I stepped closer. The platform shifted slightly beneath my feet, producing a soft creak that seemed impossibly loud. And then it was gone. No movement. No sound. The shadow simply wasn't there anymore. One moment it occupied the bench like a dark stain, and the next the bench was empty, streaked with peeling paint and black mold. My eyes darted across the carousel, searching the corners, the horses, the spaces beneath the benches. Nothing. Only the dead wood and silent figures staring with hollow eyes. The cold didn't leave with it. If anything, it grew sharper, a sudden drop that made my skin prickle. The air around me felt charged, as if a storm were about to break. I turned, expecting to see something just outside the carousel, behind a horse lurking in the trees. But the clearing was as empty as before. And then I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak. The carousel had begun to move. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, the faintest groan of old machinery shifting against years of rust. I felt the vibration through the wooden platform under my shoes. The horses trembled slightly, their faded heads bobbing with the motion. There was no wind strong enough to turn it. The air was perfectly still. My breath clouded in front of me. I stepped back, but the carousel seemed to resist, pulling at my balance, urging me forward. The scent of rust grew stronger, metallic and sharp, until it felt like breathing iron. The creak of the rotating platform deepened into a slow, rhythmic grind. The horses began their ghostly circle, each one passing in and out of the moonlight like pale phantoms. Their eyes, blank, painted things, seemed to follow me as they moved past. I stumbled back onto the gravel. The carousel continued to turn, slow and patient, as though something unseen had decided to take a ride. The bench where the shadow had been passed through the moonlight again and again, empty but somehow heavy with presence. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it could have been only minutes. The night around me seemed to thicken, the trees leaning closer with each passing rotation. My own heartbeat matched the grinding rhythm of the carousel until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The platform gave one last groan and fell still. The clearing returned to silence. My breath sounded too loud in the emptiness. I waited, staring at the bench, half expecting the shadow to return, to solidify and turn its faceless attention toward me. But nothing moved. I finally stepped back. Gravel crunched beneath my feet like brittle bones. The trees stood motionless, their branches black against the pale moon. The scent of rust and damp would lingered on my clothes as I turned and walked away, each step a battle against the urge to look back. Even now, I can still hear the faint creak of old wood when the night is quiet enough. Sometimes, when the wind carries the smell of wet earth and iron, I swear I feel that same presence, silent, patient, waiting for me to step back into the clearing and onto that carousel again. But I never will. Not again. I don't know why I decided to cut through the old neighborhood that night. Maybe it was the cool bite of the autumn air, or the strange craving to walk instead of drive, to let the night swallow me for a while. The streets were quiet, damp from a rain that had passed hours earlier, leaving the pavement slick and dark like polished stone. The smell of wet leaves clung to everything, a faint metallic scent mixed with the earthy sweetness of rotting foliage. Each step I took pressed water into the soles of my shoes with a muffled, sponge-like sound. The park appeared at the end of the road almost by accident, as though it had been waiting behind the curtain of fog that gathered low and heavy over the grass. I hadn't been there in years, not since childhood, but the outline of it was unmistakable. The skeletal jungle gym, the warped wooden benches, the half-collapsed chain-link fence leaning like it had been tired for decades. Beyond it all stood the seesaw, two weather-worn planks of wood balanced on a rusted iron pivot, its paint long stripped by rain and years of neglect. Even from the sidewalk, I could smell the faint tang of rust drifting on the breeze. It was the kind of metallic odor that sits in the back of the throat, like the taste of a coin pressed to the tongue. The park was drowned in a grayish glow from a streetlight flickering at the corner. Its bulb hummed softly, then buzzed, a dying insect trapped in glass. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the cracked asphalt paths. I stepped inside without thinking, my feet crunching over scattered gravel and fallen branches. The air felt heavier once I passed through the broken gate, as though the park held its own stale atmosphere. My breath fogged in front of me, and the cold settled around my shoulders like a damp cloth. The swings creaked faintly in the breeze, chains squealing against their corroded hooks, though the air around me had fallen still. The seesaw stood in the center, an artifact from another time. Its boards were swollen and split from years of rain, streaked with patches of orange rust where bolts had bled into the wood. The pivot joint at its center was thick with corrosion, flaking like dried scabs. I remembered sitting on it as a kid, back when the paint was still yellow and red, back when my legs barely touched the ground. Now it looked like something dug out of a grave. I stopped a few feet away, staring at it without understanding why it held my attention so completely. The air smelled stronger here, iron, soil, and the sour musk of wet wood. The ground beneath was dark with mud that sucked faintly at the edges of my shoes when I shifted my weight. Then it moved. It wasn't a sudden jerk or a quick bounce. The plank nearest to me rose with a slow, deliberate lift, the kind of motion you'd expect if someone on the other side was pushing upward with steady force. I watched, frozen, as the far end descended with a faint groan, wood grinding against iron. The sound was soft but unmistakable, an old hinge dragging through sand. There was no wind. The trees around the park stood motionless, their wet leaves glistening under the pale streetlight. My ears strained for the obvious explanation, a raccoon, a dog, anything, but the night gave nothing back. Only the faint hum of the distant streetlight and the quiet drip of water from the branches above. The seesaw held there, tilted sharply as though someone invisible sat on the raised side. The plank hovered with unnatural steadiness, not the wobbling balance of empty wood. My chest tightened as I realized how deliberate it looked, like the careful shifting of weight in a game I hadn't agreed to play. Then, with the same slow precision, it began to lower. The end nearest me sank, creaking, until the wood kissed the muddy ground with a damp thud. The opposite side rose in perfect counterbalance, stopping at the same angle it had begun. Up, down. The motion repeated, silent except for the rhythmic groan of rusted iron and the faint rasp of wood dragging against itself. I wanted to step back, but my feet remained planted in the soft earth. The smell of wet metal thickened, sharp enough to sting my nose. Each rise and fall seemed slower than the last, as though whatever force was playing with it was savoring the motion, testing the air. A droplet of cold water landed on my cheek. I flinched, glancing upward, but the branches above were dry. The drip had not come from rain. The seesaw continued its measured ascent, stopping halfway this time. as if waiting. The plank trembled faintly, not from the wind, but from something deep inside the iron pivot, like a heartbeat pulsing through rust. The sound that followed was soft, barely audible, but it was there. A whisper of pressure against wood, the faint scrape of small weight shifting across the plank. I could almost picture it. A figure sitting across from me, light enough to barely bend the wood, unseen but perfectly present. The night felt thicker with each breath, as if the fog itself leaned closer to hear what I would do next. I stepped backward. The mud gave a wet sigh under my heel. The seesaw dropped with sudden force. The side nearest me slammed into the ground so hard the wood splintered, a sharp crack echoing across the empty park. I flinched violently, heart rattling in my ribs. The opposite side shot upward, stopping abruptly with a metallic shudder. A fine mist of rust flakes drifted down like orange dust, catching the weak glow of the streetlight. Silence followed, deep and absolute. The swing chains no longer creaked. The hum of the streetlight seemed to fade, as though the world had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. I felt the pressure of eyes, no, not eyes, but a presence, settling over me like a cold shadow. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. Slowly, painfully, I turned toward the gate. The path back to the sidewalk seemed longer than it had moments before, stretched by some unseen distortion. Every step felt like pushing through syrup, my legs heavy and unresponsive. Behind me, the seesaw groaned again, a long, dragging creak that rose into the still air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the opposite side lowering, slow and steady, as though something had just climbed down. The scrape of wood against iron followed me until I reached the sidewalk, where the world seemed to snap back into motion. The streetlight buzzed again. A car passed at the far end of the road. My breath came freely. I turned once, just once, before leaving the block entirely. The park lay silent beneath the dim light. The seesaw sat perfectly level, both ends resting evenly in the mud, as though it had not moved in decades. But the smell lingered. Rust and cold earth, sharp and undeniable, clinging to the back of my throat long after I walked away. Even now, when the wind carries the damp scent of autumn, I taste that iron tang again. I feel the slow, deliberate lift of the wood beneath unseen weight. And I wonder, if I had stayed just a moment longer, what shape might have finally revealed itself on the other side of the seesaw. It was close to midnight when I first noticed her. The neighborhood was the kind of place that was never fully quiet, but that night the air felt unnervingly still, as if every familiar sound had been swallowed by something heavy and unseen. The sky hung low with a dull layer of clouds, sealing in the faint glow of the moon. Street after street stretched out before me, each one lined with narrow sidewalks and leaning telephone poles. I was heading back from a late shift, walking because my car had died earlier in the week. The distance wasn't far, but every step echoed in a way that made the streets feel endless. I remember the smell before anything else. Damp asphalt, metallic and sharp from a recent drizzle. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the pavement still clung to a slick sheen, reflecting stray glints of light like broken pieces of glass. My shoes made soft, wet noises with each step, a squish and scrape that followed me like a reluctant shadow. I passed empty houses, their windows black and lifeless. Curtains hung still, not even a hint of movement inside. It felt as if the entire neighborhood had been evacuated without warning, leaving only me to wander through its hollow remains. That was when I saw the streetlight. It stood crooked at the far end of the block, a rusted metal pole leaning just slightly, the way an old bone bends but refuses to break. The light at its top was dead except for an occasional flicker. One sharp flash, then darkness, then another flash seconds later. Each burst of illumination was harsh and white, spilling across the wet pavement like lightning caught in a jar. Beneath that erratic glow stood the figure of a little girl. She was small, no taller than the base of the pole. Her head was tilted forward, chin touching the collar of a pale dress that clung to her thin frame. The dress looked wrong for the cold night, short sleeves and a hem that barely reached her knees, the fabric limp and heavy from the damp air. Her hair, dark and uneven, hung in wet strands across her face. Each time the light flashed, her outline sharpened for an instant. Tiny shoulders, arms hanging lifeless at her sides, bare feet pressed against the glistening asphalt. I stopped. The sound of my own breathing became a loud, frantic thing. It fogged in the cold air, rising and dissolving before me. The flicker of the streetlight made it impossible to tell if she was moving. One moment she appeared perfectly still, the next she seemed closer, though my feet hadn't moved. My eyes strained to catch some detail, a twitch of fingers, a sway of fabric, but every flash only deepened the uncertainty. It was as if the darkness between each burst allowed her to shift slightly, a silent migration I could never witness directly. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. My ears caught a distant hum, a low electrical buzz that pulsed in time with the flickering light. The sound vibrated against my skull, a pressure that made my teeth ache. I tried to convince myself it was just faulty wiring, but the longer I stared, the more it felt like the sound was coming from her. I took a single step forward. The wet gravel beneath my shoe cracked softly. In that brief movement, the streetlight flashed again, and I swear her head lifted a fraction, just enough for me to glimpse the curve of her cheek beneath the tangled hair. The skin was too pale, almost luminescent against the black curtain of night. Another flash. Her face was hidden again. My throat tightened. There was no reason for a child to be out here, standing barefoot beneath a broken lamp in the middle of the night. I wanted to call out, to ask if she was lost, but the thought of breaking the silence felt dangerous. My voice would be too loud, too sharp. It might invite something I couldn't take back. So I stayed quiet and listened. The wind picked up, carrying with it a smell that didn't belong. Sweet at first, like rotting fruit, then sour, like metal left to rust in stagnant water. It seeped into my lungs and coated the back of my throat. I swallowed hard and tasted iron. The buzzing grew louder, weaving through the spaces between the flickers of light. Every time the bulb snapped alive, it cast long shadows across the slick pavement, stretching toward me like black fingers. I moved closer. Another step. Another. My footsteps felt too loud in the dead street, each one answered by the faint squeak of wet rubber on asphalt. I kept my eyes locked on the figure, afraid that looking away would allow her to disappear, or worse, reappear somewhere nearer. As I drew closer, the flickering became erratic. The intervals shortened, the bursts sharper, as if the light was struggling to stay alive against some invisible force. For a split second, the bulb flared bright and steady, washing the street in a sterile, hospital-white glow. In that frozen moment, I saw her clearly for the first time. Her head was tilted farther back now, chin raised so that the hair fell away from her face. What stared back at me wasn't the soft, round face of a child. The features were wrong, stretched in subtle, impossible ways. Eyes too large and too dark, reflecting the light like deep pools of oil. Lips slightly parted, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for a mouth so small. Her skin, too smooth, too flawless, looked almost waxy, like the surface of a mannequin. The light snapped off. Darkness rushed in like water flooding a room. My vision throbbed with afterimages, phantom outlines of that pale, twisted face lingering in the black. I froze, every nerve screaming at me to run. But some part of me, some quiet, foolish part, needed to know if she was still there. I blinked hard and waited for the next flash. When the light returned, she had moved. She now stood several feet closer, though I hadn't heard a single sound. Her feet were still flat against the pavement, but her body leaned forward slightly, as if she were caught mid-step. Her arms remained rigid at her sides, fingers curled inward like tiny claws. The space between us felt suddenly fragile, a thin sheet of glass that might shatter at the smallest breath. The buzzing in my ears rose to a painful pitch. It drowned out the world, the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of wind, until all that remained was that piercing electrical scream. My chest tightened. Each heartbeat felt like a slow, heavy thud, vibrating through the damp night air. I could feel the cold sinking into my bones, the moisture clinging to my clothes like a second skin. I backed away, one foot sliding across the slick pavement. My eyes never left her. Another flash of light, and she was closer still. The distance that had once stretched the length of the block was now no more than a few arms' lengths. Her face was clearer than ever, those black, glassy eyes fixed directly on mine. I could see tiny droplets of water clinging to her hair, shimmering like beads of mercury in the intermittent glow. The smell grew stronger, overwhelming. Rotting fruit, wet metal, and something else, something warm and unmistakably organic, like blood left to sour in the rain. I gagged, but kept my gaze locked on her. My legs trembled, the muscles quivering with the urge to run, but fear held me in place. Some instinct whispered that turning my back would be a mistake I wouldn't live to regret. The light flickered violently, a strobe of white and black. Each burst revealed her closer, closer, until the final flash illuminated a face inches from my own. Those black eyes swallowed the light, leaving only the faint reflection of my own pale, terrified face. Her breath, or what I thought was breath, was cold and sharp, a sudden drop in temperature that sliced through the damp night air. Then the streetlight went out completely. Darkness. Absolute, suffocating darkness. The buzzing stopped. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was running. My feet splashed through shallow puddles, sending ripples of cold water up my legs. The street stretched endlessly before me, the houses nothing more than dark silhouettes rushing past. My breath tore through my chest, ragged and wet. Behind me, I heard nothing, no footsteps, no buzzing, only the wet slap of my own frantic escape. I didn't look back, not once, not even when I reached the safety of my own front door and collapsed against it, heart hammering like a wild animal trapped in a cage. Inside, the silence was almost unbearable. I half expected to hear the faint flicker of a bulb outside, or the delicate scrape of bare feet across wet pavement. But there was nothing, only the lingering smell of damp metal that clung to my clothes and skin, a reminder that what I saw, or thought I saw, was real enough to follow me home. To this day, I avoid that street. Sometimes, when I take the long way home, I catch a flicker of light in the distance, a broken streetlight fighting against the dark. I never look too closely. I never stop to see if she's still standing there, waiting beneath that crooked pole, because deep down I know she is. I never planned to stop at that playground. It was just a small patch of cracked asphalt and splintered wood tucked behind a row of abandoned houses, the kind of place that barely registers in the corner of your eye when you drive past. I had been walking home after a late shift, cutting through streets I didn't usually take, when a faint metallic creak slipped through the night air. It wasn't the sound of traffic or rustling leaves. It was sharper, slower, like an old hinge turning under a heavy weight. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and rust. A storm had passed earlier, leaving behind a dampness that clung to my clothes and made the streetlights shine in a smeared, watery glow. I followed the sound without thinking, boots sinking into the soft grit scattered across the cracked sidewalk. The playground emerged from behind a leaning chain-link fence, its entrance marked by a broken gate hanging sideways on one hinge. A single swing swayed back and forth in the darkness, its squeal dragging across the silence like a dull knife against metal. The rest of the playground, slides, monkey bars, a sand pit with its wooden edges rotting, was still. The swing moved on its own, its shadow stretching long across the damp ground under the sickly yellow streetlight that flickered above it. I stood there for a long time, listening. The night pressed against my ears until I could hear every small detail. The faint drip of water from the jungle gym, the sticky suction of mud when I shifted my weight, the slow groan of the chain as the swing tilted higher. No wind touched my face. The trees stood rigid, their branches stiff like blackened veins against the overcast sky. Yet the swing moved as if someone invisible was pushing it. A faint unease settled in my chest. I took out my phone, mostly to prove to myself that it was nothing. Maybe a breeze I couldn't feel. Maybe the leftover pull from my imagination. The screen lit my hands in a cold blue glow as I opened the camera. I steadied it on the swaying swing and hit record. The lens captured every detail. The peeling red paint on the swing seat, the dull shine of wet chains, the way the shadow beneath it stretched and bent across the asphalt. As I zoomed in, the chains let out a slow, creaking wail. The swing rose a little higher, a little sharper, as if a sudden burst of force had pushed it. My breath fogged in the cold. I tapped the screen to adjust the focus. That was when I saw it. In the corner of the frame, just for a split second, something moved. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A figure, small, low to the ground, like a child crouching near the swing set. It darted behind the pole faster than I could blink. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lowered the phone, eyes scanning the empty playground. There was nothing there, only the swing, cutting slow arcs through the damp air. I raised the phone again. On the screen, the figure was back, a pale shape sitting directly on the swing seat, legs dangling but not touching the ground. It swayed forward and back, each motion perfectly in rhythm with the creak of the chains. I stared at the tiny screen, refusing to believe what I was seeing. There was no one in front of me, no child, no person, only the empty swing, moving as if guided by an unseen weight. My stomach knotted. I lowered the phone once more. Empty. The swing continued its slow, unnatural motion, but the seat was bare. When I raised the camera again, The figure remained, a small silhouette, its head tilted slightly downward, hair hanging in dark strands that shimmered under the dim light. My thumb trembled on the record button. I could feel the air around me tighten, as though the night itself was leaning closer. The scent of wet metal grew sharper, almost sour, mixing with the faint, cloying sweetness of old wood soaked in rain. I wanted to move, to turn and walk back to the safety of the street, but something anchored me there. The figure on the screen began to shift. It didn't move like a person. It flickered, its limbs blurred, as if each frame of the recording showed a slightly different posture. Legs bent, then straight, then twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn. The swing began to climb higher with each pass, chains whining like strained bones. I could almost feel the vibration through the cold air, a deep hum that buzzed in the hollow of my chest. Then my phone vibrated violently in my hand. The screen went black for a heartbeat, then flickered back to life. The camera app had closed. My reflection stared back from the dark glass, pale and wide-eyed, the playground stretching behind me in the background. A sound cut through the silence. It was faint but sharp, like the squeal of a sneaker pivoting against asphalt. My head whipped toward the swings. The seat had stopped moving completely. It hung perfectly still, chains twisted tight, as though someone had spun it and let it wind down. The air grew heavier, pressing against my skin until my ears ached. I felt a sudden drop in temperature, a cold that sank straight into the marrow of my bones. My phone screen dimmed despite the full charge, its glow fading to a faint, sickly blue. Then another sound, a soft thump, like a small foot landing on damp ground. I turned my head slowly. At the edge of the playground, near the sand pit, something pale shifted in the darkness. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even fully solid. A faint outline hovered against the black of the trees, a shape the size of a child, its edges rippling like heat waves. I could make out a suggestion of arms, of hair drifting weightlessly, of a head cocked slightly to the side. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body betrayed me. I stood frozen, staring as the outline flickered in and out of the darkness like a failing signal. My breath caught in my throat. The figure took a single step forward. The ground beneath it made no sound. The swing behind me groaned. A single, sharp creak, like a whisper pulled tight through rusted chains. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My phone slipped in my trembling grip. When I finally tore my gaze away, the swing was moving again. Slowly, gently forward and back. I ran. My feet pounded against the wet pavement, splashing through shallow puddles. The air around me seemed to close in, each breath sharp and cold, as though I were running through a tunnel of ice. I didn't stop until the glow of a distant streetlight broke through the darkness. Only then did I dare to glance at my phone. The camera was still open. The timer on the recording was running, though I had stopped it minutes ago. I lifted it with shaking hands. The screen displayed the playground behind me, every detail crystal clear. The swings, the sandpit, the broken fence, and on the swing, swaying gently beneath the flickering light, sat the figure of a child. Its head turned slowly toward the camera. Though the face was nothing but shadow, I felt its gaze reach through the screen and settle on me with the weight of a hand pressing against my chest. The video ended on its own. My phone shut off completely, battery dead though it had been nearly full moments earlier. I didn't try to turn it back on. I didn't look back. That night, long after I locked every door and checked every window, I placed the phone on my bedside table. The room smelled faintly of damp metal and old wood. I could swear I heard it again, the soft creak of a chain, the gentle swing of a seat carrying a weight that wasn't there. I haven't opened the camera app since, and every time I pass that stretch of road, I keep my eyes fixed on the ground, afraid of catching even the smallest flicker of motion from the corner of my eye. Because if I look for it, I know I'll see it. The swing, the figure, still waiting.